There are moments in history when the veil between the government we trust and the government that operates in shadow grows thin enough to glimpse what lies beneath. Tonight, we journey into that darkness, into the declassified files and congressional testimonies that reveal a pattern of experimentation so chilling that many refuse to believe it for decades. These are the true stories of ordinary citizens who became unwitting test subjects in experiments they never consented to, conducted by the very institutions sworn to protect them. Let us begin. The Cold War was an era of profound paranoia, a time when America and the Soviet Union circled each other like wolves, each convinced the other possessed secrets that could tip the balance of power forever. In the early 1950s, American intelligence officials became obsessed with reports filtering out of Korea and China about something they called brainwashing. American prisoners of war were returning home changed, some of them parroting communist propaganda with glazed eyes and monotone voices. The CIA believed the Soviets had discovered some chemical or technique that could control the human mind, and they were terrified of falling behind in what CIA Director Allen Dulles would call brain warfare. What followed would become one of the most sustained, secretive, and ethically abhorrent programs in American intelligence history. It would be given the codename MKUltra, and at its helm would be a man whose name has become synonymous with the darkest chapters of CIA experimentation, a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was an unlikely candidate to become what journalist Stephen Kinzer would later call the poisoner-in-chief. Born in 1918 to Hungarian Jewish immigrant parents in the Bronx, he grew up with a club foot and a stutter, disabilities that kept him from military service during World War II. He compensated for these perceived weaknesses with an almost fanatical drive to excel. He earned his doctorate in biochemistry from the California Institute of Technology, and by 1951 had found his way into the Central Intelligence Agency. What made Gottlieb unique was not just his scientific brilliance, but his moral flexibility. He was a man of contradictions. He lived with his wife in a cabin in rural Virginia without running water, rose before dawn to milk his goats, practiced folk dancing, and meditated regularly. Yet this same gentle soul would oversee experiments that destroyed minds and ended lives. He believed, or perhaps convinced himself to believe, that the communists had achieved breakthroughs in mind control and that America had no choice but to match them, whatever the cost. In April of 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles formally approved what would become Project MKUltra. The program's stated goal was to explore the covert use of biological and chemical materials for purposes of controlling human behavior. What this meant in practice was a sprawling network of over 150 sub-projects conducted at universities, hospitals, prisons, and psychiatric institutions across the United States and in black sites around the world. The estimated budget would grow to at least $10 million, roughly $87 million in today's currency, and the scope of the experiments would be almost beyond comprehension. At the heart of MKUltra was lysergic acid diethylamide, a chemical compound that had been synthesized in Switzerland in 1938 by a chemist named Albert Hofmann. LSD was extraordinarily potent, capable of producing profound alterations in perception and consciousness at doses measured in micrograms. Gottlieb became convinced that this drug held the key to mind control, that it might serve as a truth serum to extract confessions from enemy spies, or perhaps even allow the CIA to reprogram a human mind entirely. Gottlieb arranged for the CIA to purchase the entire world supply of LSD from the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz for $240,000. He then began distributing it to researchers across the country, often through front organizations that concealed the CIA's involvement. Some of these researchers knew they were working for the agency. Others believed they were conducting legitimate academic studies, never suspecting that their work was part of a classified program with very different objectives. The experiments took many forms, each one pushing further into ethical darkness. In hospitals and clinics, patients seeking treatment for various ailments were given LSD without their knowledge or consent. At the National Institute of Mental Health Addiction Research Center in Kentucky, African American drug addicts were administered LSD for 77 consecutive days, their reactions carefully documented by researchers who viewed them, in the words of one agency officer, as people who could not fight back. The reach of MKUltra extended into the prison system as well, where researchers found populations that could not easily refuse and whose complaints would carry little weight with authorities. James Whitey Bulger, who would later become one of America's most notorious crime bosses, was a young inmate at the Atlanta Penitentiary in 1957 when he volunteered for what he was told was a program to find a cure for schizophrenia. The promise of contributing to medical knowledge, combined with the possibility of better treatment or early parole, made prisoner recruitment disturbingly easy. Instead, he was given LSD every day for more than a year. Decades later, Bulger would describe the experience in haunting terms, recalling 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state, a total loss of appetite, and hours of living nightmares. He described seeing blood coming out of the walls and watching his fellow inmates transform into skeletons before his eyes. The goal, he eventually realized, was not to help him, but to see if prolonged exposure to the drug could permanently alter or destroy the human mind. But the experiments went far beyond LSD. Gottlieb and his colleagues explored hypnosis, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, radiation exposure, and combinations of all of these. They sought drugs that could induce amnesia, allowing agents to forget sensitive information if captured. They searched for compounds that could incapacitate entire buildings through poisoned food or cause confusion, anxiety, and fear in enemy populations. Among the most extreme projects funded through MKUltra were the depatterning experiments conducted by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatric hospital at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Cameron was not some fringe figure. He was one of the most respected psychiatrists in the world, a former president of both the American and Canadian psychiatric associations. Yet the experiments he conducted with CIA funding were medieval in their cruelty. Cameron believed he could erase a patient's existing personality and memories, reducing them to a blank slate upon which a new, healthier identity could be written. His methods included induced comas lasting weeks or months, during which patients were subjected to massive doses of electroshock therapy, sometimes hundreds of times more powerful than standard treatments. They were force-fed cocktails of barbiturates and hallucinogens, while being forced to listen to repetitive audio recordings played from speakers placed in football helmets strapped to their heads. Cameron called this psychic driving. The patients who emerged from Cameron's care were often worse than when they entered. Many had lost years of memory, their sense of self shattered beyond repair. Some could no longer recognize family members or recall basic life skills. Families were devastated. The Canadian government would eventually be sued by survivors and their families. And while the CIA's connection to Cameron's work was exposed, full accountability remained elusive. The lengths to which the CIA went to find test subjects were limited only by their imagination. At Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, dermatologist Albert Kligman conducted experiments that exposed prisoners to dioxin, radioactive isotopes, and a variety of pharmaceutical compounds. When Kligman first walked into the prison, he later said he saw acres of skin, viewing the inmates not as human beings, but as a vast testing ground for his research. The prisoners often suffered chemical burns, rashes, and long-term health consequences that followed them for the rest of their lives. Then there was the case of Harold Blower, a professional tennis player who checked himself into a psychiatric institute in New York in 1952, seeking treatment for depression following his divorce. Over the course of a month, Army doctors injected him with synthetic mescaline derivatives as part of a classified study. Blower complained of severe reactions after each injection, yet the experiments continued. On January 8, 1953, he was given a massive dose of a compound called MDA. Within minutes, his body went rigid. He began frothing at the mouth, his blood pressure dropped to nothing, and he died. The Army concealed its involvement for decades, telling his family that he had died of heart failure. What made MKUltra particularly insidious was not just the experiments themselves, but the systematic destruction of evidence. In 1973, when CIA Director Richard Helms learned that congressional investigations into agency activities were imminent, he ordered the destruction of all MKUltra files. The order was largely carried out, with thousands of documents reduced to ash. Only a small fraction survived, overlooked in a record center, and it was these files that would eventually bring the program to light. The first public glimpse of MKUltra came in 1975, when the Rockefeller Commission, established by President Gerald Ford to investigate illegal CIA activities within the United States, briefly mentioned the program. Buried on page 37 of their report was a reference to an unnamed Army scientist who had been given LSD without his consent and died a week later. This single paragraph would crack open a door that had been sealed for decades. Congressional hearings followed, led by Senator Frank Church and his Select Committee on Intelligence Activities. Former CIA officials were called to testify, including Sidney Gottlieb himself. But Gottlieb, who had supervised the program for over 20 years, proved to be a frustrating witness. His memory, he claimed, failed him on virtually every important point. He could not recall how many people had been experimented upon. He could not remember details of specific projects. He portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of atrocities. When Gottlieb finally admitted before the Senate that the experiments had yielded essentially nothing of intelligence value, that the entire program had been, in his words, useless, the admission was almost more damning than the experiments themselves. All that suffering, all those destroyed lives had been for nothing. The CIA had spent 2 decades and tens of millions of dollars searching for a way to control the human mind, and had discovered only the depths of human cruelty. Gottlieb retired from the CIA in 1972, but his legacy lived on in the shattered minds of his test subjects and their families. He spent his final years in obscurity, running a leprosy hospital in India for a time, then working as a speech therapist to help young people overcome stuttering, the same disability that had plagued him since childhood. When he died in 1999 at the age of 80, his family declined to announce the cause of death. Some who had followed his case speculated that the master poisoner had taken his own life using the very substances he knew so well. But like so much about Sidney Gottlieb, the truth remained shrouded in darkness. The CIA's obsession with mind control produced countless sub-programs, each more disturbing than the last. But perhaps none captured the bizarre intersection of sex, drugs, and espionage quite like Operation Midnight Climax. The operation began in 1954 under the direction of George Hunter White, a former journalist turned federal narcotics agent who had built his reputation as a hard-charging crusader against the drug trade. In public, White railed against substance abuse and ruthlessly pursued figures like jazz legend Billie Holiday. In private, he drank martinis by the pitcher and was more than willing to sample the very drugs he supposedly opposed. He was, in short, the perfect man for a very strange assignment. White's mission, assigned to him by Sidney Gottlieb, was to establish safe houses in San Francisco and New York, where unwitting subjects could be dosed with LSD and observed. But the operation quickly evolved beyond clinical experimentation into something far more lurid. The CIA wanted to understand how sex and drugs might be combined to extract secrets from enemy agents, and White was happy to explore this question with enthusiasm. The primary safe house was established at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco's Telegraph Hill neighborhood. White decorated the apartment to resemble, in his words, a French whorehouse. He hung Toulouse-Lautrec posters on the walls alongside photographs of can-can dancers and images of women in bondage poses. Behind a two-way mirror, he installed a comfortable observation area, complete with a portable toilet and a refrigerator stocked with martinis. The operation worked like this. CIA-paid prostitutes would frequent bars in North Beach, looking for suitable targets. When they found a man who seemed willing, they would lure him back to the safe house with promises of pleasure. Once there, the prostitute would slip LSD or other psychoactive substances into his drink without his knowledge. What followed would be observed, recorded, and photographed by agents watching from behind the mirror. The prostitutes, who received $100 per subject and were given get out of jail, free cards they could use if arrested for their regular work, were instructed to experiment with different approaches. Sometimes they were told to ask probing questions during the height of the drug experience. Other times they were directed to attempt to plant subliminal suggestions. One technique that proved particularly effective was having the prostitute stay after the sexual encounter was complete, telling the man she wanted to spend a few more hours with him. Most men found this flattering and, in their vulnerable, drug-addled state, became surprisingly talkative about their work and personal lives. The operation expanded beyond the safe houses. CIA agents began dosing people in restaurants, bars, and even on beaches, apparently more interested in seeing what would happen than in any scientific objective. One former agent later admitted to a journalist that if they were scared enough of a drug not to try it out on themselves, they sent it to San Francisco. The effects on unwitting subjects could be devastating. Wayne Ritchie was a deputy United States Marshal who attended a Christmas party in 1957. Unbeknownst to him, his drink was spiked with LSD. He experienced a complete psychotic break, becoming convinced that federal agents were closing in on him. In his deranged state, he attempted to rob a bar at gunpoint. Though he avoided prison, his career was destroyed. Decades later, when he attempted to sue the government after learning the truth, he was unable to prove the CIA's involvement definitively enough to prevail in court. For nearly a decade, Operation Midnight Climax continued, fueled by taxpayer money and a complete absence of oversight. George White, who had installed himself as the primary observer, was having the time of his life. In a letter he wrote to Gottlieb after the operation was finally shut down, he reflected on his work with disturbing satisfaction. Where else, he asked, could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, and cheat, steal, deceive, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest. It was fun, fun, fun. The operation came to an end in 1963 when CIA Inspector General John Ehrman stumbled upon its existence and was horrified by what he found. He strongly recommended closing the facilities, and the San Francisco safe houses were shuttered in 1965. But by then, the damage had been done to countless Americans who never knew they had been dosed, who struggled for years with unexplained psychological symptoms, who perhaps blamed themselves for experiences that had been deliberately inflicted upon them. Of all the casualties of MKUltra, none is more mysterious or more contested than the death of Dr. Frank Olson. His case has become a symbol of everything that went wrong with America's secret experiments, a riddle wrapped in conspiracy that remains unsolved more than 70 years later. Frank Olson was born in Wisconsin in 1910 to Swedish immigrant parents. He grew into a talented biochemist, earning his doctorate and eventually finding work at the United States Army Biological Warfare Laboratories at Camp Detrick in Maryland. During World War II and the early Cold War, Camp Detrick was the center of America's efforts to develop biological weapons, and Olson was at the heart of that work. By the early 1950s, Olson had risen to become acting chief of the Special Operations Division at Camp Detrick. His work put him in close contact with the CIA, and he eventually became a CIA employee while continuing to work at the Army facility. He had high-level security clearances and knew things that few Americans could imagine. He had witnessed interrogations at secret CIA black sites in Europe, where prisoners were, in his son Eric's words, literally interrogated to death using combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and torture. He had seen the development of biological agents capable of killing thousands. The work weighed on him, and by 1953, he was showing signs of strain. On November 19th of that year, Olson attended a semi-annual retreat of MKUltra scientists at a cabin on Deep Creek Lake in rural Maryland. Present were about a dozen men, including Sidney Gottlieb and his deputy, Robert Lashbrook. According to the CIA's later account, during the retreat, Gottlieb ordered that bottles of Cointreau be spiked with LSD and served to the unsuspecting scientists, ostensibly to study their reactions. Olson, by multiple accounts, reacted badly to the drug. While others experienced manageable effects, Olson became deeply disturbed. He grew paranoid and agitated, expressing fears about his work and saying things that alarmed his colleagues. Over the following days, his mental state deteriorated further. He told his supervisor that he wanted to quit the program. He expressed guilt about the nature of his work. He seemed to those around him to be coming apart. The CIA arranged for Olson to see Harold Abramson, a New York physician who had worked with the agency on LSD research. On the evening of November 27th, Olson and Robert Lashbrook checked into the Hotel Statler in Manhattan. They shared a room on the 13th floor. What happened next has been debated for decades. According to the CIA's account, sometime around 2:30 in the morning, Olson rose from his bed, ran across the darkened room, and threw himself through the closed window, falling to his death on the sidewalk below. The shade and curtains were drawn. The window was closed. Olson would have had to navigate past 2 beds in complete darkness and crash through glass with enough force to clear the frame. The night manager of the hotel rushed to Olson's side. He was still alive, trying to mumble something, but he died before help could arrive. When police entered the hotel room, they found Lashbrook sitting on the toilet. He seemed oddly calm for a man whose colleague had just died violently. An early morning phone call from the room was later traced. Lashbrook had called someone and said simply, "He's gone." The voice on the other end replied, "Well, that's too bad," and hung up. Olson's body was returned to his family without a viewing. They were told his face had been too badly disfigured. He was buried the next day. His widow received an expedited pension, and for 22 years, that was the end of the story. Then came 1975 and the Rockefeller Commission. Buried in the report was the mention of an unnamed Army scientist given LSD without his consent who had died. The Olson family recognized themselves in that brief passage. After consulting with the CIA, the Army confirmed that the scientist was Frank Olson. Within days, the Olson family found themselves in the Oval Office, receiving a personal apology from President Gerald Ford. The government offered a settlement of $750,000, which the family accepted. But as the years passed, Eric Olson, Frank's son, became increasingly convinced that his father had not jumped. He believed Frank Olson had been murdered because he knew too much and had become a security risk. In 1994, Eric had his father's body exhumed and examined by forensic experts. What they found was disturbing. There was a previously unrecorded hematoma on Frank Olson's skull, a wound consistent with a blow to the head. The skull fractures did not match what would be expected from a 13-story fall. James Starrs, the forensic pathologist who conducted the examination, concluded that the scientific evidence pointed to homicide rather than suicide. The New York District Attorney's Office changed the official classification of Olson's death from suicide to unknown. But the case was never prosecuted. Too much time had passed. Too many witnesses were dead. Too many documents had been destroyed. The truth about what happened in room 1018A of the Hotel Statler on that November night in 1953 may never be known with certainty. Eric Olson spent the rest of his life searching for answers. He pored over declassified documents, interviewed aging intelligence officers, and pursued every lead. What he came to believe was that his father had been killed not because of the LSD incident, but because of what Frank Olson knew about biological weapons experiments, about interrogation techniques that had crossed the line into torture and murder, about programs so secret that even the LSD experiments were a distraction from the deeper truth. Sidney Gottlieb went to his grave without ever admitting to more than the accidental dosing. But a 1953 CIA manual on assassinations, declassified years later, included a passage that seemed chillingly relevant. For killing by falling, the manual advised, the subject should be dropped from a high building or pushed in front of a speeding vehicle. The paper recommended that extreme precautions be taken to prevent observation, and that care is required to ensure that no wound or condition not attributable to the fall is discernible after death. Whether Frank Olson jumped, fell, or was pushed remains one of the great unanswered questions of Cold War history. What is certain is that he was given a powerful psychoactive drug without his knowledge or consent, that he experienced severe psychological distress in the days that followed, and that he died under circumstances that have never been satisfactorily explained. His story stands as a warning about what can happen when government power operates without oversight, when the lives of individuals become expendable in the pursuit of national security, and when secrets are kept not to protect the nation, but to protect those who have betrayed its values. While the CIA conducted its mind control experiments in secret laboratories and safe houses, another arm of the United States government was carrying out a different kind of experiment, one that would come to be called the most infamous biomedical research study in American history. It did not involve exotic drugs or classified technology. It involved simply watching men die from a disease that could have been cured, and it lasted for 40 years. The Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama, one of the poorest regions in the American South. The United States Public Health Service, working with the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black university, recruited 600 African American men for what they were told was a treatment program for bad blood, a local term that covered a range of ailments including anemia, fatigue, and syphilis. 399 of the men had latent syphilis. 201 did not, and served as controls. The men were primarily poor sharecroppers, many of whom had never seen a doctor in their lives. They were offered incentives that must have seemed remarkable, including free medical examinations, free meals on examination days, and burial insurance to ensure their families would not bear the cost of their funerals. What they were not told was that they were not receiving treatment at all. The study was designed from the beginning to observe the natural progression of syphilis in black men until they died, at which point autopsies would be performed to document the damage the disease had caused. The researchers justified their approach with racist pseudoscience. They believed that syphilis affected black bodies differently than white bodies, that African Americans were inherently more susceptible to the disease and less likely to seek treatment even if it were available. They saw themselves as conducting a study in nature, merely observing what would happen anyway rather than actively causing harm. This rationalization allowed them to continue their work for 4 decades without apparent moral qualm. In the early years of the study, standard treatments for syphilis involved painful injections of arsenical compounds, supplemented by topical applications of mercury or bismuth. These treatments were imperfect, but they could slow the disease's progression and reduce suffering. The Tuskegee subjects received none of this. They were given only placebos, pills, and vitamins that did nothing to address their condition. When the men asked about treatment, they were told that they were being treated for bad blood, a lie that would be maintained for the duration of the study. The ethical situation became dramatically worse in the mid-1940s. In 1943, penicillin was demonstrated to be a safe and effective cure for syphilis. Within a few years, it became widely available throughout the United States. For the men of Tuskegee, penicillin could have saved their lives and spared them years of suffering. Instead, the Public Health Service not only withheld the treatment, but actively worked to ensure the subjects could not receive it elsewhere. They convinced local physicians not to treat the men. They ensured that when World War II draft boards identified subjects as having syphilis and offered them treatment, those subjects were exempted from the standard protocols. The justification offered was scientific. If the men received treatment, the study would be compromised. The researchers wanted to track the disease to its final stages, through blindness, madness, and death. They wanted to perform autopsies to see exactly what syphilis did to the human body when left unchecked. The scientific value of this data, they believed, outweighed any obligation to the men who provided it. Year after year, the study continued. The men aged. The disease progressed. Some went blind. Some developed severe cardiovascular damage. Some descended into the dementia that characterizes late-stage neurosyphilis. And through it all, the Public Health Service continued to observe, document, and wait for death. The study was not a secret within the medical community. Results were published regularly in peer-reviewed journals. The researchers presented their findings at medical conferences. Yet for decades, no physician or medical ethicist raised a public objection. The men of Tuskegee were poor, black, and powerless, and in mid-century America, that was apparently enough to place them beyond the protection of medical ethics. The end came in 1972, when Peter Buxton, a venereal disease investigator with the Public Health Service, leaked information about the study to the press. Buxton had learned about Tuskegee years earlier and had repeatedly raised concerns with his superiors. He was told that the study was approved at the highest levels and would continue. When he realized that internal objections would never succeed, he went to a journalist friend who passed the story to Gene Heller of the Associated Press. Heller's article, published on July 26, 1972, began with the headline, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The American public was horrified to learn that their government had deliberately allowed hundreds of men to suffer and die from a curable disease in the name of science. Congressional hearings were convened. The study was immediately terminated. By the time the study ended, the toll was devastating. 28 men had died directly from syphilis. At least 100 more had died from complications related to the disease. 40 of the participants' wives had been infected with syphilis. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis, carrying the disease their fathers had been denied treatment for. A class action lawsuit resulted in a settlement of $10 million, along with free medical care for the surviving participants and their families. Fred Gray, a civil rights attorney who had represented Rosa Parks during the Montgomery bus boycott, filed the suit on behalf of the victims. The settlement, while significant, could never truly compensate for the decades of suffering, the premature deaths, and the intergenerational trauma inflicted on these families. The last study participant died in January 2004. As of today, 10 children of participants continue to receive medical benefits from the program established in the wake of the scandal. The most significant response came on May 16, 1997, when President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the United States government. Standing with 5 survivors of the study at a White House ceremony, Clinton called Tuskegee shameful and racist. The United States government did something that was wrong, he said, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. It was an outrage to our commitment to integrity and equality for all our citizens. But apologies and settlements could not undo the damage. The Tuskegee study did not just harm 600 men and their families. It shattered the trust between African Americans and the medical establishment, a wound that has never fully healed. Studies have documented the lasting impact of Tuskegee on Black Americans' willingness to participate in medical research, to seek medical care, and to trust the pronouncements of health authorities. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when vaccination rates among Black Americans lagged behind other groups, many cited Tuskegee as a reason for their hesitation. The echoes of those 40 years in Macon County continue to reverberate through American society. The doctors who conducted the Tuskegee study believed they were making a contribution to science. In the end, the primary contribution of their work was not to medical knowledge, but to medical ethics. The revelations about Tuskegee helped spur the passage of the National Research Act of 1974, which established requirements for institutional review boards to approve all research involving human subjects. The 1979 Belmont Report established the fundamental principles of research ethics that govern medical studies to this day. The men of Tuskegee suffered so that future generations might be protected from similar exploitation. Even as the Tuskegee study was continuing its decades-long course, American researchers were conducting even more shocking experiments in the small Central American nation of Guatemala. While at Tuskegee the subjects already had syphilis when enrolled, in Guatemala researchers took the additional step of deliberately infecting healthy people with sexually transmitted diseases. The Guatemala experiments were conducted between 1946 and 1948 by the United States Public Health Service, working with Guatemalan officials and the Pan American Sanitary Bureau. The principal investigator was Dr. John C. Cutler, who would later become one of the leaders of the Tuskegee study. The official purpose was to test methods of preventing sexually transmitted infections, particularly to find out whether penicillin could be used as a prophylactic after exposure. The experiments involved more than 5,500 Guatemalan prisoners, soldiers, mental patients, and children. About 1/4 of them were deliberately infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, or chancroid without their knowledge or consent. The methods of infection were varied and disturbing. In some cases, researchers hired prostitutes known to be infected and paid them to have sex with prisoners. When this method proved inefficient at transmitting the disease, researchers moved to direct inoculation, pouring bacteria onto abraded skin on subjects' genitals, faces, and arms. Some subjects were infected through forced spinal puncture. The researchers chose Guatemala specifically because they knew they could not conduct such experiments in the United States. In archived documents, Surgeon General Thomas Perrin acknowledged that the work could not be done domestically. The experiments were designed to answer questions American researchers had about disease transmission and prevention, using a population that was powerless to refuse. The subjects were not merely infected and observed. Some were subjected to repeated infections to study reinfection rates. Some were left untreated for extended periods to study disease progression. While most eventually received penicillin, the records are unclear about how many received adequate treatment or suffered lasting harm. 83 people died during the course of the experiments, though it remains uncertain how many of these deaths were caused by the inoculations. Unlike the Tuskegee study, which was published openly in medical journals, the Guatemala experiments were kept completely secret. The researchers never published their findings. When the study ended, the records were buried and forgotten. Dr. Cutler went on to a distinguished career in public health, eventually becoming a beloved professor at the University of Pittsburgh. He died in 2003 without ever facing accountability for what he had done in Guatemala. The experiments only came to light in 2010, when historian Susan Reverby of Wellesley College stumbled upon Cutler's papers while researching the Tuskegee study. What she found was so shocking that she reported it to federal officials. Within days, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Secretary of Health and Human Services Kathleen Sebelius issued a joint apology, calling the experiments deeply disturbing and clearly unethical. President Barack Obama personally called Guatemala's president to express his regret. But apologies do not constitute justice. Guatemalan survivors and their families filed lawsuits against the United States government, Johns Hopkins University, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and the Rockefeller Foundation. All were unsuccessful. In 2012, a federal judge dismissed the case against the U.S. government, stating that the plaintiffs' pleas for relief were more appropriately directed to the political branches than to the courts. The institutions implicated in the experiments have issued statements expressing regret, but denying legal responsibility. The connection between Tuskegee and Guatemala is not merely historical coincidence. The same researchers, the same public health service, the same ethical blindness connected both studies. John Cutler worked on both. The institutional culture that allowed men to die untreated in Alabama was the same culture that allowed researchers to infect unwitting subjects in Guatemala. The difference was merely one of degree. Guatemala also reveals how American power operated beyond its borders during the Cold War. The subjects were chosen precisely because they were Guatemalan, because they were poor, because they were powerless, because they were far from any oversight that might have restrained the researchers' ambitions. The experiments were a colonial exercise in every meaningful sense, using the bodies of a vulnerable population to answer questions that might benefit Americans. The legacy of Guatemala, like the legacy of Tuskegee, extends far beyond the direct victims. When the COVID-19 pandemic reached Guatemala, vaccination rates were among the lowest in the Western Hemisphere. Many Guatemalans expressed distrust of foreign medical programs, citing the historical exploitation of their country. The wounds of 1946 have not healed. In the years following World War II and the development of the atomic bomb, the United States government became intensely interested in understanding the effects of radiation on the human body. This was not purely academic curiosity. The Cold War had begun, and American military planners needed to know how soldiers and civilians would be affected by nuclear weapons. They needed to know how much radiation a person could survive, how it would affect their performance on the battlefield, and how to protect essential personnel from its worst effects. What followed was a sprawling program of human radiation experiments that lasted from the mid-1940s through the early 1970s. The experiments were conducted by the Manhattan Project, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Department of Defense, and various civilian research institutions. The subjects included hospital patients, pregnant women, prisoners, soldiers, and children. Most had no idea what was being done to them. The most infamous of these experiments involved the injection of plutonium directly into human subjects. Plutonium is one of the most toxic substances known to science. Outside the body, its alpha radiation is easily stopped by skin and clothing. Inside the body, it is devastatingly destructive, breaking down DNA and cellular structures, as if the contaminated person were being shot with trillions of tiny bullets every second. The first plutonium injection was administered on April 10, 1945, at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The subject was Eb Cade, a 53-year-old African-American man who worked as a cement mixer for an Oak Ridge construction company. Cade had been in an automobile accident that broke his arm and leg. While he was recovering in the hospital, Manhattan Project doctors selected him for their experiment. Cade was given the codename HP-12, with HP standing for human product. Without his knowledge or consent, he was injected with 4.7 micrograms of plutonium. In the weeks that followed, doctors collected his urine, feces, and teeth, measuring how much plutonium his body excreted and how much remained. The experiment confirmed their fears. Nearly 90% of the plutonium stayed in the body, concentrated in the bones and liver, where it would continue to irradiate tissues for years. Between 1945 and 1947, 18 people were injected with plutonium by Manhattan Project doctors. The subjects were hospital patients, chosen because they were considered terminally ill and therefore expendable. According to the official rationale, since they were going to die anyway, using them for research would at least yield useful data. In practice, some of the patients lived far longer than expected, carrying the radioactive element inside them for years or decades. The experiments extended far beyond plutonium injections. In Nashville, Pregnant women attending prenatal clinics were given radioactive cocktails to drink without being told what they contained. Researchers wanted to understand how radioactive elements crossed the placental barrier and affected developing fetuses. In Cincinnati, approximately 200 cancer patients were subjected to massive doses of whole-body radiation, not for therapeutic purposes, but to gather data for military planning. Many suffered severe radiation sickness. Some died within weeks. Perhaps most disturbing were the experiments conducted on children who could neither understand nor consent to what was being done to them. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, mentally disabled boys were fed radioactive oatmeal as part of studies on nutrition and mineral absorption. The boys and their parents were told only that they would be joining a science club and would receive extra food, with no mention of the radioactive tracers mixed into their breakfast. The researchers from MIT and Quaker Oats, which funded the studies, gave the boys membership cards for their science club and field trips to Red Sox games, small rewards for their unknowing participation in experiments that would haunt them for life. At Sonoma State Hospital in California, children with cerebral palsy were injected with radioactive iron to study iron metabolism, their developing bodies absorbing radiation without any knowledge of the risks. The experiments on soldiers were equally troubling. Throughout the 1950s, the military conducted nuclear tests in Nevada and the Pacific that deliberately exposed troops to radiation. Thousands of soldiers were ordered to march toward Ground Zero shortly after nuclear detonations, sometimes while the mushroom cloud still hung in the sky. They were not volunteers, they were following orders, and they were not told the full extent of the risks they faced. The radiation experiments remained hidden from the public until November of 1993, when Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary ordered the release of previously classified documents. O'Leary said she was appalled by what her department's predecessors had done and launched a full investigation. President Clinton formed an advisory committee on human radiation experiments to examine the records and make recommendations. The committee's final report, issued in October 1995, documented hundreds of experiments involving thousands of subjects. The committee concluded that the experiments had often been conducted without proper informed consent, that subjects had been exposed to risk without adequate justification, and that the government had failed to provide appropriate follow-up care. The report recommended that the government apologize to the victims and provide compensation. The apology came, but full accountability did not. The committee explicitly stated that their decision was to focus on representative case studies rather than cataloging every experiment, a choice that limited public understanding of the program's true scope. The release of the report was timed, perhaps coincidentally, for the same day as the O.J. Simpson verdict, when media attention was elsewhere. Many victims received small settlements. Many more received nothing at all. The radiation experiments revealed the same pattern that characterized MKUltra and Tuskegee. Researchers convinced themselves that their work was necessary for national security or scientific progress. They chose subjects who were powerless to refuse or unable to understand what was happening to them. They conducted experiments that violated basic principles of medical ethics. And when the truth emerged, the institutions responsible minimized their culpability and resisted full accountability. On Staten Island in New York City, there stood for 40 years an institution that would come to symbolize the darkest intersection of medical research and the treatment of society's most vulnerable members. Willowbrook State School opened in 1947 as a facility for children with intellectual disabilities. By the 1960s, It housed over 6,000 residents, despite being designed for 4,000. The conditions were appalling. Buildings were overcrowded and filthy. Many residents could not feed or bathe themselves. Abuse and neglect were rampant. It was into this environment that Dr. Saul Krugman of New York University arrived in 1955, tasked with addressing the endemic hepatitis that swept through the facility in wave after wave. Hepatitis was a major problem at Willowbrook. The unsanitary conditions made transmission inevitable. By some estimates, 90% of residents eventually contracted the disease. Krugman proposed a solution that seemed logical on its surface, but raised profound ethical questions. Rather than simply treat hepatitis as it occurred, he would conduct controlled experiments to develop a vaccine. His method involved deliberately infecting newly admitted children with the hepatitis virus to study the disease's progression and test potential preventive measures. The experiments began in 1956 and continued until 1971. During this period, children were fed fecal extracts from infected patients or injected with infected serum. Krugman reasoned that since virtually all children at Willowbrook would contract hepatitis anyway, he was merely accelerating an inevitable process while bringing it under scientific observation. Some children received gamma-globulin injections before exposure to test whether antibodies could prevent or reduce the severity of infection. The experiments did produce valuable results. Krugman's work helped distinguish between hepatitis A and hepatitis B, different diseases requiring different approaches to prevention and treatment. His research contributed to the eventual development of hepatitis vaccines that have saved countless lives. By purely scientific measures, the Willowbrook studies were a success. But the ethical costs were devastating. The children who served as subjects had no ability to consent or refuse. Their parents were often placed in an impossible position. Willowbrook had long waiting lists for admission, and many families could not care for their disabled children at home. The only available spaces were sometimes in the hepatitis research ward, meaning that parents who wanted their children admitted had no choice but to agree to their participation in the experiments. This was coercion dressed in the language of consent. The disease that Krugman gave these children was not trivial. Hepatitis causes liver inflammation, jaundice, nausea, and vomiting. Some forms can cause permanent liver damage or death. While most children eventually recovered, they suffered through the full course of the disease. Some became chronic carriers, capable of transmitting hepatitis to others. When these children were eventually moved into group homes or public schools, they sometimes faced discrimination because of their carrier status, adding social harm to physical harm. The Willowbrook experiments attracted criticism even during their operation. In 1966, Henry Beecher published a landmark article in the New England Journal of Medicine, listing 22 examples of ethically dubious research. Willowbrook was among them. But Krugman had powerful defenders, including the editor of that same journal, who argued that the children would have gotten hepatitis anyway and were better off under medical supervision. The broader public became aware of Willowbrook's horrors in 1972 when Geraldo Rivera, then an up-and-coming investigative journalist, produced a documentary called Willowbrook: The Last Great Disgrace. Rivera gained access to the facility and filmed conditions that shocked the nation. Residents were shown lying naked on the floor, covered in their own waste. The documentary sparked outrage and eventually led to the closure of the institution, which was completed in 1987. The hepatitis experiments ended before the facility closed, but their legacy remains contested. Some medical ethicists argue that Krugman's work, however problematic, led to vaccines that have prevented immense suffering. Others, including vaccinologist Maurice Hilleman, called the Willowbrook studies the most unethical medical experiments ever performed on children in the United States. The debate over Willowbrook continues to shape discussions of research ethics, particularly regarding the use of vulnerable populations who cannot truly consent. In the closing years of World War II, as American forces fought their way across the Pacific, malaria proved to be one of the most formidable enemies they faced. More soldiers were being lost to the mosquito-borne disease than to enemy bullets. Finding effective treatments and preventive measures became a military priority of the highest order. The research that followed would be conducted at Stateville Penitentiary, a maximum security prison near Joliet, Illinois. The facility was designed as a panopticon, with cell blocks radiating from a central guard tower in a design meant to allow constant surveillance. Beginning in 1944, doctors from the University of Chicago and the United States Army began infecting inmates with malaria to test potential treatments. The experiments worked like this. Researchers bred mosquitoes infected with Plasmodium vivax, a malaria strain that had been isolated from a military patient. The mosquitoes were then placed in cups pressed against prisoners' bare chests, where they were allowed to feed and transmit the parasite. Once the prisoners developed malaria, with its characteristic cycles of fever, chills, and sweating, they were given experimental anti-malarial drugs. Researchers documented which drugs were effective, which produced dangerous side effects, and which combinations showed promise. The principal investigator was Dr. Alf Alving, a nephrologist at the University of Chicago. Under his direction, hundreds and eventually thousands of prisoners were infected over the nearly 30 years the experiments continued. The research produced important results, including the first human tests of primaquine, an anti-malarial drug that remains in use today. But the cost was borne entirely by the prisoners who served as subjects. The prisoners were offered incentives for their participation. They received financial payments, typically $25 to $100 per experimental trial. More significantly, participation in the malaria studies was counted toward their sentences and could lead to early parole. The average Stateville volunteer received parole about 2 years earlier than he otherwise would have. This created what ethicists would later call a coercive environment. When freedom itself is the reward, can consent ever be truly voluntary? The experiments gained public attention when Life magazine published a photo spread in 1945 showing inmates with cups of malaria-carrying mosquitoes pressed to their chests. The coverage was positive, portraying the prisoners as patriots serving their country. The first line of the story read that men who have been imprisoned as enemies of society are now helping science fight another enemy of society. What received less attention was the fact that one prisoner became so central to the research that he functioned almost as a collaborator rather than a subject. Nathan Leopold, who with Richard Loeb had kidnapped and murdered a teenager in one of the most sensational crimes of the 1920s, found purpose at Stateville in the malaria experiments. He enrolled first as a subject, then took on roles recruiting other prisoners, observing experiments, serving as an X-ray technician, and dissecting mosquitoes. The experiments gave Leopold a path to rehabilitation, or at least to early parole. The Stateville experiments became an issue at the Nuremberg trials following World War II. Nazi defendants facing charges for their horrific medical experiments on concentration camp prisoners pointed to Stateville as evidence that the Americans were doing similar things. The comparison was imperfect. The Stateville prisoners volunteered and were not systematically murdered. But the argument revealed an uncomfortable truth about the use of prisoners for medical research. Recent scholarship has revealed an additional dimension to the Stateville story that was long overlooked. While the early experiments primarily involved white prisoners, black inmates were eventually brought into the research, but not to test anti-malarials. They were recruited specifically because many of them showed adverse reactions to primaquine, including a potentially fatal condition called hemolytic anemia in people with a genetic enzyme deficiency. Researchers wanted to understand these reactions, so they deliberately exposed black prisoners to a drug they knew would make them sick. These black participants were treated differently than their white counterparts. Their identifying information was published in medical journals. They were paid less than white participants had been paid for the earlier studies. Their family members were sometimes brought in for testing as well, to trace the genetic lineage of the enzyme deficiency. The ethical problems that tainted the original malaria research were compounded by the racial disparities in how the drug sensitivity studies were conducted. The Stateville experiments continued until the mid-1970s, when public attitudes toward prisoner experimentation had shifted dramatically. The Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and ultimately American regulations effectively ended the practice of using prisoners as research subjects. Today, federal regulations severely restrict research involving incarcerated populations, recognizing that the inherent coercion of the prison environment makes genuine informed consent nearly impossible. We have journeyed tonight through some of the darkest chapters in the history of American medical research and government experimentation. From the mind control obsessions of MKUltra to the deliberate infections at Tuskegee and Guatemala, from the plutonium injections of the Manhattan Project to the hepatitis studies at Willowbrook, a pattern emerges. Those with power used that power against those without it. Scientists convinced themselves that the ends justified the means, and ordinary people, trusting the institutions meant to protect them, became unwilling participants in experiments they never consented to. If you found this exploration of history meaningful, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that illuminate the shadows of our past. Your support helps bring these important histories to light. Until next time, rest well, knowing that knowledge of what came before is our best protection against its repetition.